The golden elevator descended in a silence that felt heavier than the 40 floors of marble and steel above it. Edward Thorne, a man whose name was whispered with both awe and terror in the world's most powerful boardrooms, stood alone, staring at his reflection in the polished brass doors. Usually that reflection showed a king in a $3,000 bespoke suit, but tonight the man looking back was a ghost. He had shed the silk and the status, replacing them with a tattered, ripped canvas jacket and a worn-out fedora that cast a deep shadow over his famous features. The jacket was heavy with the scent of mothballs and a life he had forgotten he once lived, its sleeves frayed and its pockets sagging with the weight of a single crumpled $10 bill. Stepping out into the cool evening air, he avoided the valet who usually waited with his armored sedan. Instead, Edward walked toward a rusted, beat-up vehicle he had purchased in cash from a scrapyard just hours before. He felt the eyes of the city on him, but for the first time in decades, they were eyes of indifference, not greed, to the world he had built. He was invisible the moment he stopped looking like a bank account. This was the great experiment, a desperate gamble for a man who had just been told his heart was failing and his children were already dividing his empire like vultures over a fresh kill. He needed to know if kindness still existed in a world he had spent 70 years believing was governed only by transaction and cold necessity. The drive took him away from the glass towers of the financial district and into the gritty, neon-soaked edges of the city where the air smelled of wet asphalt and old grease. He pulled the rattling car into the gravel lot of the Blue Collar Grill, a roadside diner where the open sign flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz. Rain began to trace slow, jagged lines down the windshield, mirroring the cracks in Edward's own resolve. He took a breath, feeling the rough fabric of his thrift store disguise against his skin, and stepped out into the downpour. As he pushed open the heavy glass door, a bell chimed, a tinny, hollow sound that announced the arrival of a man who appeared to have nothing. The warmth of the diner was thick with the scent of fried onions and cheap coffee, a sharp contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled silence of his penthouse. Edward scanned the room with a cynical eye, his judgment complex already seeking out the flaws in the people around him. He saw a group of tired laborers hunched over their plates, and a manager who looked ready to escort a beggar like him back into the rain. Then he saw her. Maya was moving between the tables with a sharp, disciplined ponytail and a professional grace that didn't belong in a place this worn down. She looked exhausted, her eyes carrying a weight that suggested a life of double shifts and mounting bills. Yet she didn't flinch as Edward approached the counter. He chose a booth in the corner, sliding onto the cracked vinyl seat, like a man burdened by the world. He was ready to play the part of the customer from hell, to poke and prod at her patience until she showed him the same greed and ugliness he saw in his own children. He reached into his pocket and felt the $10 bill, the weapon he would use to test her soul. As Maya approached with a carafe of steaming coffee, Edward lowered his fedora, the billionaire gone, replaced entirely by a man in rags waiting for the world to fail him one last time. The scent of burnt decaf and industrial floor cleaner hung heavy in the air as Maya adjusted her apron, her fingers brushing against the crumpled hospital invoice tucked into her pocket. It was a habit now, a physical reminder of the $1,200 surgery balance that stood between her daughter's recovery and a looming collections notice. Her feet ached within her worn sneakers, a dull throb that had begun 4 hours into her double shift, but as she looked toward the corner booth, she smoothed her expression into one of practiced, professional warmth. She had noticed the man in the tattered canvas jacket the moment he walked in, his presence carrying a strange, heavy silence that seemed to push back against the diner's ambient noise. "Welcome to the Blue Collar Grill," Maya said, her voice steady and kind as she stood before the man in the shadowed fedora. "Can I start you off with them coffee, or do you need a minute with the menu?" She didn't flinch at the sight of his frayed sleeves or the way he kept his head low. To her, he wasn't a vagrant. He was a person who looked like he had walked a very long way through a very cold night. She had seen that look in her own mirror during the weeks her daughter spent in the pediatric ward, the look of someone who was just trying to survive the next hour. Edward Thorne watched her through narrowed eyes, his cynical mind already cataloguing her movements. He expected the typical signs of a service worker on the edge: the rolled eyes, the hurried tone, the transparent disdain for a customer who clearly wouldn't be leaving a large tip. He had spent his life surrounded by people who only moved when money was the motivator, and he was certain Maya would be no different. He let out a low, performative grunt and gestured vaguely at the chipped mug on the table. "Coffee. Black. And make sure it's actually hot this time," he barked, his voice raspy and intentionally abrasive. Maya didn't miss a beat. "You got it. I just brewed a fresh pot so it'll be steaming," she replied with a genuine smile that reached her eyes, despite the exhaustion behind them. She turned and moved with efficient grace toward the station, her mind briefly drifting to the small apartment across town where her mother was watching her little girl. Every hour Maya stayed here was an hour toward the safety fund, a goal that felt like an unreachable mountain, yet she treated this abrasive stranger with the same dignity she would afford a high-paying regular. As she poured the dark liquid into his mug, a stray drop splashed onto the table. Edward immediately scowled, leaning forward to highlight the tiny mess. "Careless," he muttered, loud enough for the neighboring booth to hear. Maya simply reached for the rag on her belt. "I am so sorry about that, sir. Let me get that cleared up for you right away," she said softly, wiping the spot with a quick, practiced motion. She didn't argue, and she didn't show the irritation Edward was so desperately fishing for. Instead, she placed a clean napkin beside his hand. "Is there anything else I can get started for you? Our breakfast special runs all night." Edward looked at the napkin, then up at Maya. He was searching for a crack in the armor, a sign that her kindness was a mask she was wearing for the manager's benefit. But the manager was busy arguing with a vendor in the back, and the other customers were buried in their own plates. Maya was being kind because it was her nature, an instinctive response to a world that was often unkind. To Edward, it was a confusing anomaly, a glitch in his worldview that both fascinated and infuriated him. He hadn't come here to find a saint. He had come to confirm his belief that everyone had a breaking point. "Just the menu," he snapped, grabbing the laminated folder from her hand. Maya nodded, her smile never wavering as she stepped back to give him space. As she walked away to check on a regular at the counter, she felt the weight of the medical bill in her pocket again. She needed every cent she could get tonight, yet as she looked back at the lonely man in the tattered jacket, she found herself hoping the hot coffee would at least take the chill out of his bone. She didn't know she was being audited by a billionaire. She only knew that everyone deserved a warm meal and a moment of respect. Edward watched Maya move away, his eyes cold and calculating as he began the next phase of his experiment. He didn't want a pleasant meal. He wanted a confrontation that would validate his belief that humans were only as good as their circumstances allowed. He needed to see her snap, to see the professional mask crumble into the same bitter entitlement he saw in his own children back in their glass towers. He waited until she was occupied with a heavy tray of plates for a nearby booth. With a deliberate sweeping motion of his elbow, he accidentally knocked the full mug of black coffee across the table. The liquid surged like a dark tide, soaking through the sugar packets and dripping steadily onto the floor in a loud rhythmic patter. Edward didn't move to stop it. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms over his tattered jacket and letting out a sharp, impatient tick. "Look at this," he barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the diner. "The table is uneven. I barely touched it and now I'm soaked. Does anyone actually clean this dump?" Maya turned, the weight of the heavy tray straining her arm, but her face remained a calm, neutral canvas. She didn't sigh, she didn't roll her eyes. She quickly delivered the plates to the other customers and hurried over with a stack of fresh towels and a spray bottle. "I am so incredibly sorry, sir," she said, her voice soft but firm as she dropped to her knees to catch the coffee before it reached his boots. "That's entirely my fault. I should have checked the table's balance when you sat down. Let me get this cleaned up so you can enjoy your meal in comfort. Edward watched her work, his jaw tightening. She was scrubbing the floor with the same diligence she would use on a palace floor, her disciplined ponytail swaying as she moved. He decided to push harder. As she reached for the empty mug, he threw a handful of used, crumpled napkins into the puddle she was trying to dry. "And the sugar is all gone now," he complained, his tone dripping with a forced nasally whine. "I can't drink coffee without sugar. Is it too much to ask for basic service in this place, or are you too busy chatting with the regulars?" A silence fell over the surrounding booths. The laborers nearby glanced over, their faces hardening at the old man's unnecessary cruelty toward a woman they knew worked 3 jobs to keep her head above water. Maya, however, didn't look up for support. She simply gathered the wet napkins and stood, her breathing slightly more labored, but her eyes still clear and professional. "You're absolutely right, sir. I'll bring a fresh sugar caddy and a hot replacement for your coffee immediately," she said, offering a small, tired nod. "I want to make sure the rest of your night is much better than the start." Edward felt a flicker of something, not guilt but a frustrating confusion. He was a master of the judgment complex, a man who believed he could bait anyone into showing their worst self. Yet, here was a woman facing an internal battle of medical bills and exhaustion, being pushed by an abrasive stranger, and she refused to give him the satisfaction of a fight. He was the agitator, the enemy in the rags of a king, but as Maya walked away to fetch his sugar, he realized the stakes of his game were rising. If she didn't break, his entire cynical worldview was at risk of being dismantled by a woman who made less in a month than he spent on a single lunch. The fresh mug of coffee Maya placed on the table was steaming, a small plume of white vapor rising into the humid air of the diner, but to Edward it was merely the next prop in his theater of cynicism. He waited until she had turned her back to assist a truck driver at the counter before he acted. He took a small glass of ice water from the edge of the table and poured it slowly into the hot coffee, watching the steam vanish as the temperature plummeted. He stirred it with a stained spoon, ensuring the liquid was tepid and uninviting. Then he waited for Maya to return. When she finally looped back to his booth, her face still wearing that resilient professional calm, Edward didn't wait for her to speak. He took a deliberate dramatic sip and immediately spat a portion of it back into the mug with a look of pure disgust. "This is garbage," he hissed, his voice echoing in the quiet lulls of the diner's jukebox. "I asked for hot coffee. This is lukewarm pond water. Do you people even know how to use a percolator? Or are you too busy daydreaming about being anywhere else?" Maya paused, her hand hovering over her apron pocket where the hospital bill rested, a silent weight that reminded her she couldn't afford to lose her temper. She looked at the mug, then back at the man in the ripped canvas jacket. She knew she had brought that coffee out at a near boil, but she didn't argue. She didn't point out the physics of how a drink loses heat that quickly. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her gaze steady and empathetic. "I am so sorry, sir," she said softly, her voice devoid of the defensive edge Edward was fishing for. "There must be something wrong with the heating element in that pot. It's a cold night out there, and the last thing you need is a cold drink. Let me go back and brew a completely new batch just for you." Edward narrowed his eyes, his judgment complex flaring. He wanted her to tell him he was lying. He wanted her to snap so he could feel justified in his low opinion of the world. "A new batch," he snapped. "By the time that's done, I'll be dead of old age. You're just trying to stall because you're incompetent." Despite the insult, Maya didn't flinch. She reached out and gently took the mug from the table. "It'll only take me 3 minutes. I promise," she said with a tired but sincere smile. "And while you wait, would you like a warm piece of apple pie on the house? It sounds like you've had a long day, and sometimes a little something sweet makes the wait go faster." Edward sat in stunned silence as she walked away. He had insulted her intelligence, her work ethic, and her dignity, yet she had responded by offering him more than he had even paid for. He felt the $10 bill in his pocket, a meager sum he intended to use as a final insult, but the weight of it suddenly felt different. Maya wasn't just passing a test, she was rewriting the rules of the game. Edward had played his entire life. As he watched her disappear into the kitchen, the billionaire felt a strange, uncomfortable sensation.
the beginning of a crack in the armor he had worn for 70 years. The 3 minutes Maya promised had stretched into 5, but when she returned, the coffee was so hot it sent plumes of white steam curling toward the diner's ceiling. Beside the mug sat a thick slice of apple pie, the crust golden, and dusted with cinnamon sugar, just as she had offered. Edward Thorne didn't thank her. He didn't even look at the pie. His mind was focused entirely on the check that sat tucked under the edge of his saucer. He picked up the slip of paper with a hand that felt uncharacteristically heavy. The total was $9.50, and a substantial amount for a roadside diner, accumulated through his deliberate ordering of the most expensive steak on the menu, 3 sides he barely touched, and the repeated replacements of his cold drinks. Edward reached into the pocket of his tattered canvas jacket, his fingers brushing against the crisp, cold texture of the bills he had prepared. He pulled out a single $100 bill, its clean edges a sharp contrast to his frayed sleeve. This was the moment he had rehearsed in his mind, the final blow to Maya's relentless grace. In the world Edward inhabited, a 10% tip on a difficult, demanding table was a calculated insult, a way of telling a worker they were barely worth the air they breathed. He laid the $100 bill on top of the check, and then reached for the crumpled $10 bill he had been clutching all night. With a slow, deliberate movement, he smoothed the $10 bill out on the laminate table, placing it directly in front of the coffee mug. He watched Maya out of the corner of his eye as she approached to clear the neighboring table. He wanted to see her eyes widen as she calculated the math. The $90 tab, an hour of abuse and a $10 reward. He expected the flicker of resentment, the tightening of her jaw, or perhaps a sarcastic thank you that would finally allow him to leave feeling justified in his cynicism. "I'm heading out," Edward announced, his voice regaining its raspy, authoritative edge. As he stood up and pulled his fedora low over his brow, he pointed a gnarled finger at the $10 bill. "Keep the change from the 100, and there's a little extra for your effort. Don't spend it all in one place." Maya paused, her gaze dropping to the table. She looked at the $100 bill, then at the single $10 note resting beside the untouched pie. For a second she was silent, and Edward felt a surge of dark triumph. He was certain he had finally found the breaking point. He imagined her thinking of the hospital invoice in her pocket, the $1,200 surgery balance that this $10 wouldn't even begin to dent. "Thank you, sir," Maya said quietly. Her voice wasn't filled with the anger he anticipated. Instead it held a strange, hollow quality. She picked up the money with a steady hand, and looked Edward directly in the eyes. "I truly hope the rest of your night is kinder to you than the start of it was. Safe travels." Edward didn't reply. He turned and walked toward the heavy glass door, the bell chiming a mocking farewell as he stepped back out into the pouring rain. He made it halfway across the gravel lot to his rusted car before he stopped, the cold water soaking into his thrift store jacket. He had delivered the $10 insult, yet he didn't feel like a winner. He felt like a man who had thrown a stone at a mirror, only to find the glass was unbreakable and the only thing shattered was his own reflection. The rain had transitioned from a steady drizzle to a rhythmic drumming that blurred the neon outlines of the diner's sign. Edward Thorne stood by the driver's side door of his rusted sedan, his hand gripping the cold metal handle, but he did not open it. Water cascaded off the brim of his fedora, dripping onto the shoulders of his canvas jacket, until the fabric was heavy and sodden. He was a man who moved through life with the calculated precision of a chess master, and right now he was waiting for the inevitable counter-move. He checked his watch, a cheap plastic thing he'd bought to match his disguise, and watched the seconds tick by. In his mind, the scene was already written. Maya would reach the table, count the meager $10, and the reality of her situation would finally collide with the insult he had left behind. He imagined her face flushing with the heat of a double shift's worth of repressed anger. He expected the diner door to fly open, the bell to clang violently, and for her to come charging across the gravel to scream at him for his stinginess, his arrogance, and the mess he had made of her night. He wanted that scream. He craved the ugliness of it, because it would prove that her kindness was a lie, a transactional mask worn in the hope of a payout. If she yelled, Edward could get into his car, drive back to his penthouse, and die in peace, knowing that his cynical worldview was the only absolute truth. He stood there, a billionaire in rags, shivering in the dark, effectively begging for a reason to keep hating the world. Minutes passed. A truck roared by on the nearby highway, its tires kicking up a wall of gray mist, but the diner door remained shut. Through the fogged glass of the restaurant windows, he could see the amber glow of the interior. He saw Maya's silhouette moving with that same measured pace, clearing the plates, wiping the table where he had sat, and disappearing back toward the kitchen. There was no explosion. There was no chase. The silence of the parking lot was more deafening than any shout could have been. Edward felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest, a physical manifestation of his failing heart, or perhaps something deep. He had spent billions to insulate himself from the world, yet here, standing in the mud of a roadside parking lot, he felt more exposed than he ever had in a boardroom. He had offered her a $10 insult, and she had countered it with a silence that felt like a judgment. He began to turn the key in the lock, his fingers numb, but just as the engine groaned to life, the diner door finally swung open. Edward froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He saw the flash of her white apron against the dark night. Maya stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the rain, her eyes searching the shadows of the lot. Edward straightened his spine, preparing himself for the confrontation he had engineered. He waited for the anger, for the vitriol, for the moment his world would return to its bitter, predictable axis. But as Maya spotted his car and began to jog toward him, she wasn't clutching the money in a fist of rage. She was holding it out like a lifeline she was afraid he'd drop. The gravel crunched beneath Maya's sneakers as she sprinted through the downpour, her breath coming in shallow bursts that misted in the frigid air. Edward stood paralyzed by the open door of his car, the engine's uneven idle sounding like a dying heartbeat in the damp silence. He braced himself for the impact of her words, certain that the vitriol was coming, the inevitable explosion of a woman pushed too far. He looked at her hand, expecting to see the $10 bill crumpled into a ball of resentment, ready to be hurled at his chest. Instead, Maya stopped a few feet away, her shoulders heaving and her hair plastered to her forehead by the rain. She wasn't angry. Her eyes, usually so sharp and professional, were filled with a profound, quiet sorrow that made Edward's throat tighten. She took a step closer and reached out, gently pressing the $10 bill and the $5 change back into his numb, calloused palm. Her fingers were ice cold, but her touch was remarkably soft. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the drumming rain. "I can't take this from you. I saw you earlier, sir. I saw the way you were counting the coins in your pocket before you ordered. I saw the holes in your sleeves." Edward looked down at his hand, the wet money sticking to his skin like a brand. He tried to summon his abrasive persona to bark a command or an insult that would re-establish the wall between them, but the words died in his lungs. He was a man who owned entire zip codes. Yet in this moment, under the flickering light of a diner parking lot, he felt smaller than he had ever been. "I have a job," Maya continued, her voice gaining a fragile strength. "I have a roof over my head, and I have people who love me. You look like you've been forgotten by everyone. I noticed you didn't even eat the pie I brought you. You were too busy staring at that check like it was a death sentence." She reached out and touched the frayed edge of his canvas jacket, her expression one of genuine concern. "Use this money, please. Go to the thrift shop down the street tomorrow and buy yourself a better coat. The winter is coming, and you won't survive it in this." The cynicism that had anchored Edward's soul for 70 years didn't just crack. It vanished, leaving a terrifying wide-open void. He had spent his life believing that everyone wanted a piece of him, that every smile was a transaction, and every kindness was a trap. He had waited for Maya to show her greed, to prove that she was just as hollow as his own children. But she was standing in a storm, likely wondering how she would pay her daughter's medical bills, and she was giving up her own livelihood because she thought a stranger was suffering more than she was. Edward finally managed to choke out, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he hadn't felt since childhood. "I was a nightmare to you in there. I made a mess. I was rude. I gave you almost nothing for an hour of your life. Why would you do this?" Maya wiped the rain from her eyes and gave him a small, sad smile that shattered the last of his defenses. "Because being a guest isn't about how much you pay, sir. It's about how you're treated. My mother always told me that kindness isn't kindness if it comes with a price tag. You looked like a man who needed someone to see him, not just serve him. Keep the money. I'll be okay." She turned without waiting for a reply, jogging back toward the diner's warm amber glow, her white apron disappearing into the mist. Edward stood alone in the dark, the $10 bill clutched in his hand. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a billionaire. And he didn't feel like a beggar, he felt like a human being, judged and found worthy by a woman who had every reason to walk away. The great experiment was over, and as he sat in the driver's seat of his rusted car, Edward Thorne began to weep, the tears mixing with the rain on his face as he realized he finally knew exactly what to do with his empire. The drive back to the city was a blur of neon streaks, and the rhythmic, hypnotic slap of the windshield wipers. Edward Thorne gripped the steering wheel of the rusted sedan, his knuckles white, while the $10 bill, Maya had returned, sat on the passenger seat like a holy relic. It was a small piece of paper, damp and wrinkled, but it felt heavier than all the gold bars locked in his private vaults. For 30 years, Edward had lived behind a fortress of ice, convinced that the only way to protect his legacy was to keep it away from a world he believed was inherently rotten. Now that ice had not just melted, it had been shattered by the simple, selfless honesty of a woman who had nothing left to give, yet gave anyway. By the time he reached the underground garage of his glass and steel fortress, the tears he had shed in the parking lot had dried into salty tracks on his cheeks, but the raw, aching clarity in his chest remained. He didn't wait for the garage attendant to recognize him. He bypassed the private entrance and rode the elevator to the top floor in a state of crystalline focus. The tattered canvas jacket felt like a second skin now, a reminder of the man he had almost forgotten he could be.
The penthouse was silent, a vast expanse of marble and modern art that suddenly felt like a tomb. He walked past the portraits of ancestors who had built their wealth on conquest and toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the shimmering, uncaring city. He saw his own reflection in the glass, a disheveled old man in a beggar's coat, framed by the lights of a billion-dollar empire. He looked at the reflection and, for the first time in 3 decades, he didn't see a titan. He saw a man who was finally ready to go home. He reached for the secure line on his mahogany desk and dialed a number he knew by heart. It was 3 in the morning, but for Arthur Sterling, the Thorne family's lead counsel for 40 years, the phone was never out of reach. "Edward?" The lawyer's voice crackled, instantly alert. "Is everything all right?" The security team said, "You went off the grid 6 hours ago. Your son has been calling every 20 minutes asking about." "Forget about Marcus, Arthur," Edward interrupted, his voice raspier than usual, thick with the remnants of his emotion. "And forget about the current draft of the will. Burn it. Delete the files. I want to start over. Right now." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Edward, you're talking about $3 billion in liquid assets and the controlling shares of the foundation. We spent 2 years tailing your heirs to protect those trusts. You can't just—" "I found her, Arthur," Edward said, his gaze fixed on the $10 bill he had placed on the desk. "I found the one who doesn't want the money. I found the one who tried to give it back." As he began to dictate the new terms, his voice grew steady, fueled by a purpose that transcended his failing heart. He described the blue-collar grill, the hospital bills he knew Maya was hiding, and the quiet dignity of a woman who saw a human being where everyone else saw a ghost. He commanded that the entire Thorne legacy, the scholarship funds, the medical research trusts, and the global philanthropic arm be placed under a sealed trusts. The beneficiary was to be Maya Brooks, not as a recipient of charity, but as the sole trustee and executor. "She won't know," Edward instructed, his hand trembling as he picked up a fountain pen to sign the temporary authorization. "Not until I'm gone. I want her to keep being who she is. I want her to stay pure until the world needs her to lead it." When he finally hung up the phone, the room seemed to brighten. The heavy, suffocating weight of his wealth had transformed into a vessel for something else, hope. He sat back in his leather chair, the pen rolling away across the desk. He looked at the $10 bill one last time and smiled. He was dying, yes, but for the first time in his life, Edward Thorne felt like he was finally going to live on. The seasons had shifted with a cruel indifference, turning the autumn rains into a biting, relentless winter that rattled the thin windows of the blue-collar grill. For Maya, the 6 months since that strange rainy night had been a blur of survival. She had managed to scrape together enough for the surgery deposit, but the debt still loomed like a shadow, and her daughter's recovery was slow. Every night she glanced toward the corner booth, the one with the cracked vinyl and the uneven table, half expecting to see a man in a tattered canvas jacket waiting to complain about his coffee. He never returned, but the memory of his wet, trembling hands and the way he had wept in the parking lot stayed with her, a quiet ache she couldn't quite name. The diner was quiet on a Tuesday afternoon, the air smelling of toasted sourdough and wood smoke. A small television mounted above the counter, usually tuned to local weather or sports, hummed with the somber tones of a breaking news report. Maya was wiping down the counter, her mind miles away, until a name cut through the static of her thoughts. She looked up, the damp rag frozen in her hand. On the screen, a high-resolution photograph of a man appeared. He was dressed in a suit that likely cost more than the diner itself, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his gaze sharp and commanding. It was a face built for boardrooms and history books. The headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen read, "Titan of Industry Edward Thorne passes away at 72. Maya leaned against the counter, her breath hitching. The news anchor spoke of a reclusive genius and a complicated legacy, mentioning a sudden heart failure that had claimed the billionaire in his penthouse. But Maya wasn't looking at the suit or the skyscrapers in the background. She was looking at the eye, even through the digital screen. Those eyes, piercing, cynical, yet hiding a deep unspoken hunger, were unmistakable. They were the same eyes that had watched her from beneath a wet fedora. The man she had thought was a beggar, the man she had offered her own meager earnings to save from the cold, was one of the wealthiest men on the planet. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the winter wind raced down her spine. She remembered the $10 bill she had pressed back into his hand. She remembered telling him he needed it more than she did. A sudden dizzying sense of realization washed over her. He hadn't been a victim of the world. He had been a master of it, hiding in plain sight to see if anyone would care for the man beneath the money. The diner door opened, letting in a gust of snow and the chime of the bell, but Maya didn't move. She stared at the screen as the broadcast transitioned to footage of Edward's children, Marcus and Elena, standing on the steps of a courthouse, looking more like accountants than mourners. They spoke of continuity and rightful inheritance, their faces tight with a greed that Maya now recognized as the very thing Edward must have been running from. That night. "Maya? You okay, honey?" the manager asked, noticing her paleness. She couldn't answer. She felt a strange, profound grief for a man she had only known for an hour, a man who had come to her, looking for a reason to believe in something, and whom she had treated with the only thing she had, a dignity that didn't have a price. She looked back at the empty corner booth, now bathed in the weak winter sunlight, and realized that the great experiment had been real. She had no idea that while she was worrying about rent and medicine, a dying king had been sitting in her station, deciding the fate of an empire based on a cup of coffee and a returned tip. The winter morning was silent until the heavy rumble of engines began to vibrate the salt-stained windows of the blue-collar grill. It wasn't the familiar chug of a delivery truck or the roar of a local's motorcycle. This was a synchronized, low-frequency hum that signaled the arrival of something foreign to this neighborhood. Maya looked up from the register as a line of 3 identical, jet-black SUVs pulled into the gravel lot, their tires crunching over the frozen slush with an expensive, muffled grate. The diner fell into an uneasy hush. The regular patrons, men in high-visibility vests and stained caps, stopped mid-bite, watching as 4 men in dark overcoats and earpieces stepped out of the lead and rear vehicles, taking up positions like sentries in the freezing wind. Finally, the door to the middle SUV opened. A man with silver hair and a briefcase that looked like it cost more than the diner's entire inventory stepped out. He adjusted his silk tie, looked up at the flickering neon sign, and walked toward the entrance, with the weary, determined gait of a man fulfilling a sacred vow. The bell chimed, the same tinny sound it had made for Edward Thorne 6 months ago. But today it heralded a different kind of ghost.
The silver-haired man removed his leather gloves and scanned the room until his eyes locked onto Maya. He didn't look at her with the condescension of the wealthy. He looked at her with a profound, almost spiritual curiosity. "Maya, he asked, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent in the service of the Thorne family. "I am," she replied, her voice steady despite the frantic thudding of her heart. She wiped her hands on her apron, the same one she had been wearing when she returned a $10 bill to a man she thought was a beggar. "My name is Arthur Sterling. I was the personal attorney and closest confidant to Edward Thorne." He stepped closer, placing a thick, cream-colored envelope on the laminate counter. 6 months ago, a man came in here looking for proof that the world hadn't entirely lost its soul. He was a man who had everything, yet possessed nothing. He told me that in this diner, amidst the smell of grease and the sound of the rain, he found the only person in his 72 years who treated him like a human being when there was absolutely nothing to gain from it. Maya felt the air leave the room. The laborers at the counter leaned in, sensing the gravity of the moment. Arthur Sterling opened the envelope and pulled out a document embossed with a gold seal, the final signature Edward had made in his glass tower. "Edward's children fought like wolves to stop this," Sterling said, a small grim smile touching his lips. "They called him insane. They called you a manipulator. But Edward was the smartest man I ever knew. He locked every door and sealed every crack. This document makes you the sole trustee and chairwoman of the Thorne Foundation. You are now the steward of $3 billion in assets, dozens of medical research facilities, and a global network of shelters and scholarship funds. He didn't leave this to you as an inheritance. He left it to you as a mission. He said you were the only one with a heart large enough to know how to spend it." Maya stared at the document, the legal jargon blurring before her eyes. She thought of her daughter's inhalers, the stack of bills on her kitchen table, and the $10 bill that had started it all. She remembered the way Edward's hand had trembled when he took the money back. It hadn't been about the coat. It had been about the fact that someone cared if he was cold. "I don't know how to run a foundation," she whispered, the sheer scale of the gift threatening to crush her. Edward knew that. Sterling replied gently. He said, "You already knew the only thing that mattered, that guests don't pay for kindness. The rest, we will teach you, but the vision is yours." Outside, the black SUVs waited, their engines idling in the cold, ready to whisk her away to a world of boardrooms and private jets. But Maya looked back at the corner booth, the one where a billionaire in rags had finally found his She took a deep breath, untied the strings of her stained apron, and laid it carefully on the counter. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the guardian of a legacy built on the belief that a single act of decency is worth more than a kingdom. As she stepped out into the winter air, she didn't see the power of the motorcade. She saw a second chance for the world, delivered by a man who had to lose everything to find the truth.